I have stood in a frozen field at 6 in the morning with a transit and a tripod, waited out the black flies in June with sweat running into my eyes, walked property lines through bush so thick you couldn't see the fellow 10 feet ahead of you, and signed my name to better than 3,000 surveys across this county over 40 years. I never once put the corner in the wrong place. I never imagined the thing I'd get wrong, at 74, would be the three people who once slept under my own roof when they were small enough to carry. The surgeon was a calm young fellow, Dr. Sandhu, maybe 40, who'd done the operation enough times that he could call a hip replacement very routine, the way you'd say a sentence you'd said 1,000 times. He said it kindly. He just said it the way people say a thing isn't serious when it isn't their hip on the table. I told him that sounded fine. I have a habit of saying things sound fine. It is the most expensive habit I own, and it has cost me more than any survey ever brought in. Welcome to Dad's Cold Revenge. Settle in and pour yourself a coffee, because this one takes a while to get where it's going, and it's worth the drive. Tell me in the comments what part of the country you're watching from. I read every single one. And if a story about a man finally getting his affairs properly in order is the kind of thing you're here for, hit that like button and subscribe so the next one finds its way to you. My name is Lloyd Crozier. I'm 74 years old. I live just outside Lindsay, Ontario on Hartley Line in a house I helped frame myself in 1981. I was an Ontario land surveyor for 40 years. My whole working life I told people exactly where their land stopped and where the neighbors began to the centimeter, and I was never wrong about it. Because a survey either closes or it doesn't. The math has to come back around to where it started. Or you've made a mistake somewhere, and you go back out and you find it. I could find anybody's line but my own. I lost my wife, Maureen, 4 years ago this past February, and I have lived alone on Hartley Line since, and I had told myself the way widowers do, that I had raised 3 good kids and that whatever came next, I wouldn't be facing it by myself. I told them 6 weeks before the operation, 6 weeks. 42 days. I want you to hold that number because the whole thing turns on it. Not 6 hours notice, not a phone call from a hospital bed. 6 full weeks, during which any one of my 3 children could have circled a date on the calendar that hangs in their kitchen, asked a boss for a couple of days, or pointed a car up the 115 and the 35 and driven the hour and 40 minutes to sit with their father before they put him under at 74. I'm going to tell you exactly what each of them did with those 42 days, and I'm going to tell it the way I'd read a survey. Line by line, no editorializing, and you can do the math yourself at the end. My oldest is my daughter Janice. She's 52. She called me on a Sunday evening, and I could hear a hockey game going somewhere behind her, and that particular flatness in her voice that tells you a person is talking to you and scrolling their phone at the same time. She said, "Dad, don't worry, we'll work out a schedule, we'll take turns." And then, in the same breath, smooth as anything, she asked whether I'd had the place reassessed lately, and whether I'd given any more thought to what happens with the cottage down on Sturgeon Lake. Just wondering. Just thinking ahead. She has been thinking ahead about that cottage since roughly the day her mother passed. My middle one is my son, Dale. He's 49. He sent me a text message that ran 4 paragraphs, and I'll give him this. It was a heartfelt piece of writing. Work was brutal right now. The boys had hockey 3 nights a week and a tournament in Whitby. Steph's mother wasn't well, but of course he'd be there. Of course, Dad, we've got you. Count on it. He used the words "of course" 3 separate times. I've noticed that people who say "of course" that often are usually rehearsing the reasons they won't be able to. And then there's my youngest, Kendra. She's 44. In August, I'd sent her an e-transfer for $11,000. She and her husband were short on a furnace and some other things. And I didn't ask many questions, because she's my baby and that's what the money's for. After the operation came up, she called once, said all the right things in about 90 seconds, told me to feel better, and that was the last I heard from her until it was over. The money went one way. Nothing came back the other. The operation itself went fine. Dr. Sandhu was as good as his word. I woke up groggy in a room at Ross Memorial with my new hip and a button to push for the nurse, and I lay there in that first afternoon feeling not too bad, all things considered, and waited for the door to open. It's a small hospital. The parking's easy. I knew the route they'd take. I had it mapped in my head the way I map everything, and I lay there and I watched the door. The first day, no one came. I told myself that was sensible. It was the day of the surgery. Everyone knew you slept it off. There was no point. The second day, no one came. Janice texted to say she was so sorry. The roads were bad coming through the Kawarthas, and she didn't want to risk the drive with the freezing rain. There was no freezing rain. I checked. I have looked at a sky professionally for 40 years. Now, I should tell you what was supposed to be a 4-day stay turned into 13. Because I know somebody in the comments is going to say, no Canadian hospital keeps a hip patient that long, and you'd normally be right. But on the third night, my legs swelled up and they found a clot, and then I spiked a fever from an infection at the incision, and what should have been a quick recovery turned into IV antibiotics and a longer stay, and then a bed in the transitional unit while they got me steady enough on a walker to go home. So it was 13 days. 13 days in November, with the first real snow coming down outside the window, and the dark coming at 4:30 every afternoon the way it does up here. Dale called twice. Both calls were short, and both calls were a list of reasons he hadn't come yet, and a promise about when he would. He said he'd come Saturday. Saturday came and went. He said the following Wednesday, for sure, he'd booked it off. Wednesday he sent a text at 2 in the afternoon that said the tournament got moved and he was so sorry and he'd make it up to me. I read that text. I set the phone face down on the rolling table they wheel across the bed, and I looked at the empty chair beside me, a beige vinyl chair, the kind every hospital in this country owns 10,000 of, and I felt something settle in my chest, not anger. I want to be clear, there were no tears and no fury. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling I'd get out in the field, when I'd check a measurement twice, and realize the line I'd been counting on wasn't where I'd thought it was. A correction. A foundation shifting under you, slow and certain, the kind you can't shift back. On the 7th day, a nurse named Priya came in to take my blood pressure. She was somewhere in her 50s, the kind of unhurried kindness you only get from someone who has seen every version of a human being there is. She'd been on my ward most of the stay. She glanced at the chair, the way she'd glanced at it a few times that week, and this time she set the cuff down on the bed, and she looked at me and she asked very gently, "Do you have any family nearby, Mr. Crozier?" And I said, "I do, yes." And I smiled when I said it. I don't fully know, even now, what that smile cost me, but I know it cost something, and I know I haven't gotten it back. She nodded the way people nod when they've heard the thing you didn't say louder than the thing you did, and she finished with the cuff, and before she left, she put her hand over mine on the blanket and squeezed it once. Just the once. She said, "You push that button any time of the night, all right? Any time." I have thought about that hand over mine every single day since. A woman I had known for 7 days. On the 13th day, they discharged me. Dr. Sandhu came by, said the recovery was excellent, shook my hand. A volunteer wheeled me down to the front doors in a wheelchair. Hospital policy, they told me, even though I could walk fine on the walker by then, and I found that both touching and a little absurd. I sat in the chair by the sliding doors with a walker, a discharge sheet, and a little white paper bag of pills, and I called a cab. The driver was a young fellow named Jaspreet, couldn't have been 30, and he asked if I'd had a good stay, and I told him it was a hospital, and he laughed at that, and we drove out the 35 toward Hartley line in a comfortable kind of quiet. He didn't try to fill it, which I appreciated more than I could have said. When we got there, he came around and helped me up the steps and right to my door, carried my bag, waited until he was sure I was steady. I gave him a good tip and thanked him, and he nodded the way young men nod, when they can sense there's more to a thing than they're being told. And he went back to his cab and pulled out, and I stood on my own porch for a minute before I went in. I don't entirely know why I stood there. My hip ached. There was snow halfway up the steps that nobody had cleared, and a drift across the drive, and the porch light I'd left on 13 days ago had burned out. But I stood there a minute looking at the door I'd hung myself in 1981, and the brass handle Maureen picked out, and then I went inside. The house was exactly the way I'd left it. Now, that sounds like nothing. It is not nothing. When a man lives alone, and leaves for 13 days, and comes home to a house that is exactly the way he left it, what that means is that no one came. No one came in to turn the heat up off the setting I'd left it at. No one came to take the milk out of the fridge that had gone off, or to bring in the flyers and the mail jammed to bursting in the box by the road, or to run the tap so the pipes didn't freeze, or to clear the steps so an old man with a new hip wouldn't break his neck on the ice the day he got home. No one had set foot in it. The wood stove was stone cold. The whole house was cold, that deep cold a closed-up house gets in November that you feel in your teeth. I stood in my own front hall leaning on the walker, and I let myself understand it all the way down. I want to tell you what I did next, because I think it matters, and because some of you have been there too, and you'll know whether I did it right. I didn't call Janice. I didn't call Dale. I didn't call Kendra. I got the wood stove going. It took me the better part of an hour, bending the way you can't bend after a hip. And I put the kettle on, and I sat down in Maureen's chair by the window with a cup of tea, and I watched the snow come down in the yard light, and I thought. I thought about Priya's hand over mine. I thought about the empty beige chair. I thought about 42 days, and 3 kids, and the cottage, and the $11,000, and the words, "Of course, Dad," sitting in my phone in their nice, neat paragraphs. And when the tea was gone, I picked up the phone, and I called the one person I trusted to do this properly. I called Mark Lemieux, who has been my lawyer for 26 years. It was past 8, and he answered anyway because that's the kind of man he is. If you've been with me this far, do me the one small favor. Hit subscribe. Most folks who watch never do, and it costs you nothing, and it means more than you'd think to a fellow telling you the truth about his own family. Here's a thing I learned in 40 years of surveying. You do not react. You respond. There's a difference, and the difference is the whole job. A reaction is a tantrum, a slammed door, a thing you shout that you can't take back. A response is measured. You set up your instrument, you take your readings, you check them, and then you drive the iron bar into the ground, exactly where the math tells you the corner is, and that corner is the truth, and it stays the truth long after everybody's stopped arguing about it. Mark listened to me for a good 20 minutes without interrupting once. When I finished, he was quiet a moment, and then he said, "Lloyd, are you sure about this?" And I told him I'd been sure since the 7th day, since a stranger asked me if I had any family, and I had to lie to a kind woman to keep my dignity. He said he'd draw up the papers. I thanked him, and I hung up, and I finished feeding the stove, and I went to bed in my own cold house, and I slept better than I had in 13 nights. 6 weeks after I got home, when I could get around well enough to host, I phoned all 3 of them and asked them to come for supper. I want to be precise about why, because precision is the only thing I've ever been good at. I wasn't laying a trap exactly. I wasn't going to put on a show of being weak so they'd feel bad. I was doing something simpler and colder than either of those. I was going to give them one clean, easy opportunity to show me who they were, with nothing on the line and no pressure on them at all. And then I was going to remember it accurately and act accordingly. That's all revenge is, when an engineer's son does it. It's just a record kept honestly, and the consequences that follow from it. I made a pot roast the way Maureen used to, with the little potatoes and the carrots from the cold cellar. I made her butter tarts for after, runny, not firm, the way this family has always argued they should be. And I'll tell you, those tarts are a memory more than they're a dessert, and I was generous enough to share the memory. I dug out the good placemats she bought years ago at the church bazaar. I put the kettle on. By the time they got there, I was, by every visible measure, a warm old man who was simply glad to have his children at his table. Janice came first. She always comes first. She came in with a bottle of wine I'd put at around $30, and a hug she held a beat longer than a normal hug, and then her eyes went around the front room while she still had her coat half off. The crown molding, the fireplace. The built-ins I put in myself in '88. Out the back window toward the lake, even though you can't see the cottage from here, just the dark where it is. A quick professional appraisal, dressed up as a fond look around. "Place looks great, Dad," she said. I told her it looked exactly the way it's looked for 30 years. "I know," she said. It looks great." Dale came about 10 minutes late with a store-bought apple pie, and the energy of a man who knows he owes a great deal more than a pie, but is hoping the pie will carry some of it. He hugged me hard, and I could feel the relief in it, finding me upright and walking. Then he sat down and started in on the hospital, the whole thing he'd clearly been working over for 6 weeks. The tournament that got moved, Steph's mother, the brutal stretch at work, a furnace issue that I am fairly certain did not exist. He said I felt terrible about it twice. I've found that people who feel terrible about a thing usually move heaven and earth not to do it in the first place. I listened to every word. I didn't argue with a single one. I just took it all in, the way I'd take in a set of field notes, and I filed it where it belonged. I told him I understood completely. He let out a breath. I passed the carrots. Kendra came last, half an hour after the time I'd said, wearing the same faintly bored look she's worn, since she was 13, like life is a waiting room, and she's owed a better one. She kissed my cheek. She sat down. She didn't say a word about the hospital. She didn't say a word about the $11,000. She asked what was in the roast and checked her phone twice before the plates were cleared. I watched the three of them, Janice's eyes drifting to the cottage in her mind. Dale laughing a half second too quickly at everything I said. Kendra eating like a woman who has no idea she's auditioning for anything. And when there was a lull, I set my fork down and I said, lightly, that the surgery had got me thinking the way these things do, and that I'd been in to see Mark to get everything tidied up and in order, just so it's all where it needs to be when the time comes. And I watched the table change. It was small, a straightening of posture, a sharpening of attention. But I've spent my whole life reading land for the smallest change in grade, and I felt the load shift the second I said it. That's very sensible, Dad, Janice said carefully. So responsible, said Dale. Kendra looked up from her phone for the first time all evening. I picked my fork back up and asked who wanted a butter tart. What came after that unfolded over the next few months, exactly the way you'd expect a thing to unfold when it's been measured properly. Janice started phoning every Sunday at 10 in the morning, 10 on the dot, and she'd ask after my hip and my sleep and my appetite, and then somewhere around the 15-minute mark, she'd find her way, very naturally, to a question about the house. Had I looked into a reverse mortgage? Did I know what the place would assess at now? Had I thought about whether it really made sense, at my age, to keep the cottage, with the taxes and the upkeep? Just practical things, Dad. Just thinking ahead. Dale started coming up on Saturdays with actual groceries, not gas station flowers, real thoughtful groceries, the coffee I drink, the right bread, things he must have noticed and remembered. And I'll tell you the truth, sitting across from my son in my own kitchen on those Saturday mornings, I felt something I hadn't braced for. Grief. Not for what was happening, but for what could have been happening all along. There was a version of Dale who could have walked into that beige chair on day 3, or day 6, or any one of those 13 days, with the right coffee and a deck of cards, and just sat. That Dale existed. He was right there in front of me with the groceries. He'd just saved himself for after the will got mentioned. I drank my coffee and asked about the boys' hockey, and I was, as always, warm. Kendra started texting. Short ones, the grammar a little loose, but texts. Hey Dad, how's the hip? Stay warm out there. Once, with no words at all, a photo of a sunset over the lake, which I took to be her version of poetry, and I answered every one of them with full sentences and proper punctuation, because I'm 74 and I was raised right. They came, they called, they brought the coffee and the questions, and they performed for me a devotion they could have simply given, 6 weeks before a surgery, for nothing. Now they gave it as an investment. And I let them. I never once mentioned the hospital again. Not a word, not a hint, not even the kind of pointed silence that lets a person know there's something you're not saying. I gave them nothing to defend against, nothing to apologize for. The hospital had happened. I'd understood it alone in a cold house with a cup of tea, and I didn't need them to be sorry. I needed them to understand. And understanding, in my experience, doesn't come from a conversation. It comes from a consequence. And the consequence was already drawn up in Mark's office, waiting. I'll tell you what's in it, because you've come this far and you've earned the survey. There are 3 charities where 3 names used to be. The first is the Royal Canadian Legion branch here in town, because my own father came back from overseas to a country that mostly forgot to ask, and because there are men and women in that hall who held things together when nobody came for them either. The second is a scholarship in geomatics at Fleming College, the surveying program, where they teach young people to find the true corner of a thing, because I believe in building what lasts, and a young mind with the right instrument in its hands is the most durable structure I know how to fund. And the third is the Ross Memorial Hospital Foundation, the Patient Comfort Fund, the one that buys warmer blankets and better chairs for the rooms where people sit waiting for someone who isn't coming. I made that gift in Priya's name. I didn't tell her. I didn't need to. The house on Hartley Line and the cottage on Sturgeon Lake that Maureen and I built ourselves the summer of '93, and the RRSPs and the GICs and all of it, it goes to the estate to be sold, and the money goes to those 3 places. Mark has known since November. Mark is patient and exact, 2 qualities I prize, having spent a career around people who were neither, and he'll handle every line of it exactly the way I've drawn it. Now, somebody's going to ask about the grandkids, because that's the part that snags people, and they're right to ask. I thought about them a long while. I sat with it. And what I decided is this. A small fixed amount goes to each grandchild, held in trust until they're 25, with no strings to their parents at all, because the children didn't choose any of this, and I won't punish them for a debt they didn't run up. But the bulk of it, the house and the lake and the name, that doesn't pass down through people who couldn't spare one afternoon. That part I'm at peace with. There's one more thing in the file. A letter. One page in my own hand. In the small, clean drafting print, I've used my whole life to make sure a number could never be misread. It's addressed to the three of them, to be opened after. I'll tell you what it says, more or less. It says, by the time you read this, you'll have questions, and I want to answer the one that matters, because I spent 40 years believing that people deserve accurate information. I had a hip replacement. I was in the hospital 13 days. The surgery was on a Tuesday in November, and I came home in a cab on a Thursday 2 weeks later, and I cleared the snow off my own steps. I told you 6 weeks before, I'm not writing this to wound you. I'm writing it because every line in this document has a load-bearing reason behind it, and you deserve to see the measurements. The house was built well. I kept it up. I hope the money does some good. I loved you the whole time. That part never moved. Lloyd Crozier. I should tell you, too, about the Nguyen's, the young couple who moved into the place next door 2 summers back, who I barely knew to wave at. While I was in the hospital, the husband cleared my drive twice with his own snowblower without being asked, because he noticed the mailbox filling up and put it together. And the week I got home, his wife knocked on my door with a pot of soup and a loaf of bread still warm, and she stayed 20 minutes and asked about my hip and never once asked about anything else. I'd lived beside them for 2 years and couldn't have told you their first names before that week. Strangers came. The cab driver came up my steps. A nurse held my hand. The kids next door cleared my snow. My own blood couldn't find an afternoon. I've stopped being angry about that, mostly. But I haven't stopped noticing it, and I won't. It's April now. The lake's been throwing off the ice for a week. With that groaning crack it makes at night that always sounds like the world breaking and is only the world coming back. I had coffee on the back deck this morning for the first time since fall, with a blanket over my knees, and a chickadee came down onto the railing about 3 feet from me and sat there a good while, turning its head, regarding me with that bright black-eyed indifference, owing me nothing, expecting nothing, free as anything alive. I raised my cup to him. He stayed 9 or 10 seconds, and then he was off into the cedars, and I went back to my coffee. I met Janice for lunch last week, at the diner on Kent Street, the one with the good clubhouse and the burnt coffee. She talked for a while about her job and a course she's thinking of taking, and then she got quiet, and she looked down at her plate, and she said, "Dad, I'm sorry I didn't come to the hospital. I've been trying to figure out how to say it for months." And I looked at my daughter across the table, her sandwich going cold, and I felt the whole complicated weight of it, the love that doesn't ask to be earned, and the wound that doesn't need a scene, and the forgiveness that is not even slightly the same thing as forgetting. And I said, I know. I didn't say it's all right, because it wasn't all right. I didn't say don't worry about it, because she ought to worry about it a little for a long time. And I did not say that her name has already come off a document in a filing cabinet in Marc Lemieux's office and isn't going back on. I said I know, and I meant it, and I picked up my coffee, and we kept talking, and it was, in the way that's still available to us, a decent lunch. That's what they'll inherit, the three of them. They think they're getting a house and a cottage and a man's whole working life. What they're getting is Saturday mornings, if they want them. They're getting butter tarts and the odd phone call, and a father who, in spite of all of it, never once managed to stop being warm to them. That's what's on offer. That's what I've got left to give. If you've been counting along with me this whole time, the 42 days, the 13, the $11,000, the one hand on mine from a woman I'd known a week, then you've already done the math I did. Sitting in a cold kitchen in November, with a walker and a cup of tea, and the clearest information about my own children I have ever had in my life. And I'll ask you the thing I've been asking myself, because I read every comment, and I want to know where you land. If it had been you in that bed, would you have crossed their names off the way I did, or would you have left them on, no matter what? I've made my peace with my answer. I'm not sure it's the right one. I'm only sure it's true. The corner's set. The iron bar is in the ground. The survey closes. The math comes all the way back around to where it started, and there's no error in it anywhere. I've checked it twice. The chickadee will be back tomorrow, most likely. The ice will be off the lake within the week. Everything is exactly where I've decided it needs to be, And for the first morning in a long while, sitting here with my coffee and my new hip and the whole green smell of the thaw coming up off the yard, that is the least troubling thought in my head.